It's been a rocky time for the Conservatives as of late. On the day the budget was tabled, Chris d'Entremont, the only Conservative MP from Nova Scotia, crossed the floor to the Liberals. 2 days later, Matt Jeneroux, a Conservative MP from Edmonton, announced he would be stepping down altogether. His name had also been circulated as someone who might join the Liberals. It's certainly not the first time a party has been in this kind of situation. But what's happened recently is leaving Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre in an increasingly precarious position. So today, Campbell Clark is here. He's the Globe's chief political writer. He'll explain what all this means for Poilievre and what we can learn from defections of days gone by about the moment Conservatives are in right now. I'm Cheryl Sutherland, and this is The Decibel from the Globe and Mail. Hi, Campbell. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
There's been quite a bit of political drama last week. So on a scale of 1 to 10, where 1 is, I got a flat tire and I fell in a puddle on my way to work, and 10 is, I got a promotion and there's free lunch in the office, how did Poilievre's week compare?
Well, it was a lot worse than falling in a puddle in your car getting a flat tire. It was pretty bad. He's probably more like a bear has chewed off my foot, and I hope it grows back. This is a really bad week for Pierre Poilievre. We don't know if it's disastrous. I don't know what number to put on it, but it is something that left him in trouble.
Mm. And what kind of details do we have right now about how everything went down with the Conservatives last week?
Well, I mean, we know quite a bit about how Chris d'Entremont crossed the floor. And in fact, he had been expected to cross the floor, but he kind of gave it away with a sort of offhand remark to a journalist from Politico. So then the thing started bubbling up while the budget lockup was going on. He made a statement later that evening, even though he was going to cross the floor, that sort of forced speculation about other MPs, including Matt Jeneroux, who, a couple of days later announced that he would resign as an MP in a few months rather than crossing the floor himself. He'd been expected, or at least there'd been a lot of rumors that Matt Jeneroux from Edmonton would cross the floor too.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And so we're talking about two people here. Can you just put this into perspective? Is this really a big deal?
It is a big deal because the Liberals are so close to a majority, and that means a lot in Parliament, but also in Canadian politics. So at the election on April 28th, the Liberals won 169 seats out of 343. Now, with Chris d'Entremont crossing, they've got 170. So they are still 2 seats short of being able to command a majority in the House of Commons. What that means is they could fall at any time on a confidence vote. If they get a majority, they won't fall on a confidence vote. So they're more or less ensured to be able to live out their full term of 4 years. It would change everything for Pierre Poilievre because he would go from being an opposition leader who might be prime minister next year to an opposition leader who would be sitting on the opposition benches till 2029.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. We actually learned some details as well as what happened with d'Entremont. And d'Entremont himself actually said in an interview that apparently Scheer barged into his office.
Yeah, so there was an interview that Chris d'Entremont gave several days after he crossed the floor, where he sort of said that one of the things that sealed the deal on him crossing the floor was that 2 Conservative MPs, so that's Conservative House Leader Andrew Scheer, the former party leader, and the Conservative Whip Chris Warkentin, barged into his office on the day that the rumor sort of started getting out there, barged into his office, sort of pushed their way past his assistants and sort of called him, a snake. Now, the Conservatives have sort of pushed back on this, by the way, and said, it wasn't really the abrupt sort of threatening confrontation that Chris d'Entremont claims, that they just sort of came in and asked him what was going on. But there is a thing that story underlines, and that is there is a bit of an issue within the Conservative caucus for Pierre Poilievre about the people who are sort of protecting and defending him, because there's a bit of a clique there that Andrew Scheer and Chris Warkentin kind of represent the people who protect the Prime Minister. And there's a group of MPs in the Conservative caucus who don't really like those guys and don't really like the sort of hard line of Praetorian Guard around the leadership that they represent. So that's part of the sort of division within the Conservative caucus.
Okay. I want to get back to the week Poilievre had last week. So usually after the budget is delivered, the leader of the opposition gives a speech in reply to the budget and then moves an amendment to alter it. But Poilievre didn't do that. Is that unusual?
So it's very unusual. So this is a formal thing that happens in Parliament. One of the things that's the most formalized in the House of Commons is the way the budget is dealt with. And there's a process, and it leads to a confidence vote that in a minority parliament could defeat the government. And the way that works is the finance minister gets up one day and presents his budget, and the next day, the first order of business is the opposition leader gets up and gives his speech in reply and moves a motion to amend the budget. And then the next party leader, the third party leader, in this case, the Bloc Québécois, would get up and move a sub-amendment. So that's what's expected of the opposition leader. Pierre Poilievre had one job and he failed to pull it off at the end of his speech. And that's a big deal. Like in terms of Parliament, maybe people at home won't really notice it, but everybody in Parliament noticed it. And it looked like, a big miss, a big gap, a big lapse. And the kind of thing that Pierre Poilievre wouldn't normally forget. He's been in the House of Commons since 2004 for 21 years. So, that was a major lapse, and you had to wonder just how rattled was he?
Based on what we're hearing right now, does it sound like more MPs could cross the floor?
So put it this way, it's still a possibility. At least Conservatives are still talking about it as a possibility. Now, out in public, a couple of them, like Gérald Deltel, who from Quebec, has said, no more will be crossing the floor. But, I've been talking to some Conservatives and they're not as sure as that. But certainly that is what a lot of Conservative MPs and staffers are talking about. Is there someone else? How many might go? What happens if they do?
Mm-hmm. Let's talk about Poilievre's reaction to all of this. Let's start with d'Entremont. How did he respond when d'Entremont crossed the floor?
Well, he more or less didn't. He sort of gave a shrug to it, and it was left to his lieutenants to really reply to it. And, they expressed disappointment. Andrew Scheer suggested that it was, sort of dishonest that Chris d'Entremont had been kind of lying to his constituents because he ran as a Conservative and then is crossing the floor. And that is sort of the typical thing that you hear about floor crossers from the party that they leave. Mr. Scheer didn't feel that way when a Liberal crossed the floor to the Conservatives when he was the party leader, and he actually made Leona Elleslev the floor crosser, the deputy leader of the Conservative Party. So, it tends to be in the eye of the beholder, the morality of a floor crosser. But also, I think the sort of general feeling was amongst many Conservative MPs was disappointment that it had come to this, and that maybe, this should have or could have been avoided. A little bit of confusion, too, because, in some cases, they just don't really understand why he left.
What about Matt Jeneroux? Did Poilievre react differently for that situation?
Yes, well, the reaction was very different, and that's because Matt Jeneroux didn't actually cross the floor. And, there has been a lot of discussion about what was happening there. Certainly, Matt Jeneroux had been talking to Liberals about possibly crossing the floor. And in the end, he didn't cross the floor. So the response from the Conservatives, from Pierre Poilievre, was much more laudatory. It was, we wish him well in the future. There was the mention of the fact that even though he was going to resign, he was going to stay on for a few months, which seemed very bizarre. And then there was the strange statements from Mr. Jeneroux that there had been no coercion involved.
Which is a weird thing to say. It's
a strange thing to say. But of course, there had been rumors of coercion, and there still is lots of talk of whether he was coerced within the Conservative Party. Rumor mill is still going strong on that. So what exactly has happened there still hasn't pushed completely into public view.
Okay, yeah. So if we look ahead to next week, Parliament will vote to pass the budget on Monday. And this is a confidence vote. So the government could fall and we'd be back in an election campaign. But given where the Conservatives are right now, is that something they'd be ready for?
So, yes and no, I suppose. You would think that the Conservatives don't want an election right now when their party leader seems to be on the back foot. And, there is some speculation that, it's the Liberals that want an election right now because of that. What we still don't know, even now, less than a week away from that confidence vote, is how an election will be avoided. So it could be avoided in a couple of ways. One, the most obvious way is that some MPs, let's say the 7 NDP MPs, decide to vote with the government. That's, easy. Then there's 7 more votes. and the budget passes. So right now, with Chris d'Entremont, the Liberals have 170 votes in a 338-seat parliament. They're too short. One seat, by the way, is the Speaker, who doesn't vote unless there's a tie. That has happened before. But basically, they need 2 more MPs, or they need 4 who don't vote. You know, in the past, there would be, oh, no, these people just happened to not show up. We don't know where they went. But that's harder to do now because there's electronic voting and MPs can vote with their phones as long as they're in the country. So maybe some will have to leave the country for some kind of emergency. I don't know. But, that has been the way these things have worked out in the past. Or, you could just have not a few people show up so that your party could vote against the budget, but you could not trigger the defeat of the government.
We'll be right back. So, Campbell, it seems like there's a lot of turmoil among the Conservatives right now. Can you give us some context for when we've seen a party in this kind of situation before?
So often, opposition parties are in turmoil after an election that they've lost, and there's division, right? So, you've seen it after every previous election of the last few times that the Conservative leader has lost their job. And back in the early 2000s, the Progressive Conservative Party, which was by then sort of a rump party and being led by Joe Clark, their MPs were being picked off by the governing Liberals sort of on a regular basis. There were several. And there was another occasion when there was, high drama in a minority parliament about whether MPs would cross the floor to give the government a majority or keep it in power. And that was back in 2005 when Paul Martin had a minority Liberal government, and they were 3 seats short of passing their key votes in parliament. And a Conservative MP, Belinda Stronach, she was a scion of the Magna Auto Parts family, and she'd run for the Conservative leadership. And a Conservative MP who crossed the floor just days before a crucial confidence vote when Prime Minister Paul Martin was in danger of seeing his government fall. We, the journalists, were all sitting in the National Press Theatre for a press conference with the Prime Minister when we caught sight of her coming in the door, and we all sort of gasped because we knew what it meant. It meant that there was another Liberal MP, and the Liberals would probably survive the next vote. And when Paul Martin said that the significance of it was not that they would win the vote, everybody in the room laughed, because obviously the significance was they were about to win a vote and the government was going to stay in power and not be defeated. And a couple of days later, that's in fact what happened. There was a tie vote in the House of Commons, and the Speaker broke the tie and the government survived.
Mm-hmm. You mentioning this moment here with Belinda Stronach, and then, of course, the moment in the present day with d'Entremont, it makes me think about who knows what when, like what happens when it comes to crossing the floor. So what does happen behind the scenes for someone to actually cross the floor?
Well, usually there's like a long period of courting, sometimes negotiation. We've seen some of that break into the open at times. Back in those Paul Martin days I was talking about 20 years ago, there was a Conservative MP named Gurmont Grewal who was apparently talking to the Liberals about crossing the floor, and Mr. Martin's chief of staff, Tim Murphy, went to have a private meeting with him to try to convince him to cross the floor. And Mr. Grewal recorded the conversation in which, Paul Martin's chief of staff was saying, if you do want to cross the floor, there will be a nice, fuzzy, warm welcome mat for you that we will lay out. Nothing specific about we'll give you this job. And I think some of those negotiations are sometimes that specific, as it was the case of Belinda Stronach, but there was definitely a feeling of we will make you very comfortable and good things will happen for you. Yeah. And it was kind of an embarrassing moment for the Liberal government, sort of seen to be begging a Conservative MP to cross the floor.
Yeah. So let's talk about the reasons why MPs would cross the floor. What are the reasons behind why they would do it?
Well, look, there's some obvious reasons I think that we could all sort of see that you might get a better job, you might have a better career if you cross the floor. The case of Belinda Stronach, who became the Human Resources Minister, joined the cabinet immediately when she crossed the floor. That's very unusual, but that was obviously something that she had to gain in her political career from crossing the floor. And I think when you're talking about opposition MPs crossing to the government side, there's often a feeling that maybe they could accomplish something more on the government side. And there's also the dissatisfaction issues with your own party. and the people issues. And I think those are often pretty serious, right? They combine together. So you're feeling like perhaps, you're not treated the way you deserve to be treated, or you don't like a group of people within your own party who A, are either pushing you around, or B, just you don't see eye to eye with, and you feel like you're not in the right club. One case that is ideological was when the old progressive Conservatives merged with the Canadian Alliance to form the new Conservative Party. Scott Bryson, who was a Nova Scotia MP, crossed the floor to the Liberals, and his argument was that my party left me, not the other way around.
Okay. So I want to bring it back to the specifics of Pierre Poilievre's leadership. As of the time we're speaking, one Conservative MP has crossed the floor, another has resigned, and it sounds like there is, at the very least, the possibility of more defections. So what does this mean for Poilievre and the Conservatives right now?
So it means a lot for both. In Mr. Poilievre's case, it could mean everything, right? So I was talking to some MPs yesterday. If there's no more floor crossers, this probably could be a situation that was, an eruption that could eventually just go away over time, that he could sort of win over the people in his caucus, in his party. He already has, I think everyone thinks, control over the rank and file of the party enough that he can win the leadership review vote in January, that he faces in January at a party convention. But then there are people, Conservatives, who will say, but if two more Conservatives cross the floor to the Liberals, and the Liberals have a majority, then Pierre Poilievre is done. Because that changes a lot for the calculations for the Conservative Party. It means they're no longer trying to defeat a minority government so that they can have an election sometime in the next year or two. It means they're sitting on the opposition benches till 2029. And if Pierre Poilievre's management of his own caucus has led to the Liberals gaining a majority after the election, I think that will be a very damaging situation for him. Now, there's something in between, right? So there could be no floor crossers. There could be two floor crossers. And if there's just one, well, then there's going to be a lot of tension because then the Liberals are one seat short of a majority. And whoever is thinking about crossing the floor, if anyone is, from the Conservatives to the Liberals at that point, well, they know that if they cross the floor, then they're going over to a majority government that will be in power for 3.5 years, that they're not going to face an election campaign in their own riding that they have to worry about for 3.5 years. That changes the calculations quite a lot.
So, Campbell, it sounds like all this political drama has kind of overshadowed any news out of the budget. So where do you think that leaves Mark Carney right now?
Well, I think it's bought him some time. He was going to be under pressure this fall because he'd been making so many promises from the moment he got into politics. He'd been setting expectations high. We're going to focus on the economy. We're going to build Canada strong. I mean, that was his slogan, build Canada strong. He led people to believe that he would be the best person to negotiate with Donald Trump. And I think we all know that hasn't gone anywhere. Maybe it wasn't going to go anywhere good anyway. But certainly he had created a great deal of expectations. He's created the expectations that he would find ways to develop Canada's oil and gas resources and also protect the climate through reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. All these sort of expectations of what he's going to be able to do were coming due this fall. There was, impatience about it, in particular about the cost of living. Those things were supposed to be addressed in large part in the budget. At least he led us to believe that. Mark Carney did by calling it a generational budget. He'd built up the expectations. The budget itself didn't deliver as they had implied, but nobody's asking too many questions about not living up to those expectations because the political system has been distracted into what's going on with the Conservatives. In other words, the Conservatives, who are supposed to hold the Liberals government to account over their budget, ended up saving the Liberals over their budget, or at least giving them some comfort over their budget. This has bought Mark Carney some time, right? Because at least until next spring, he's not likely to face another money bill budget after the one that he faces next week. Not a big money bill budget. He's got some time to sort of live out, implement some of his promises. And, this was going to be a pressure point for Mark Carney, and it is no longer.
Campbell, always great to have you on the show. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
That was Campbell Clark, the Globe's chief political writer. That's it for today. I'm Cheryl Sutherland. Our producers are Madeline White, Michal Stein, and Ali Graham. Ali Graham mixed this episode. David Crosby edits the show. Adrian Chung is our senior producer, and Angela Pacenza is our executive editor. Thanks so much for listening, and I'll talk to you tomorrow.